the intense horror of nightmare came over me. A voice sobbed, "Let me in, let me in." "Who are you?" I asked, struggling to disengage myself. "Catherine Linton," it replied. "I'm come home." As it spoke, I discerned, obscurely, a child's face looking through the window.
Emily Bronte changed what it was possible for women to write. It is that important as a novel, to me, but I would say also in a broader sense. And people didn't think she really connected with the world. And the reviews were savage. And they were, if I'd written this, I'd be ashamed, to, if I'd written this, I would kill myself.
But what appealed for you at the time? Was it the writing itself? Was it the characters?
I think it's rage. I was very happy.
So it's a mood, really?
The mood of it, the fact that Cathy is awful, that a heroine doesn't have to be a passive, quiet, compliant girl. Because almost everything that you're kind of given as a girl then is that this is what a girl should be. Things are a lot changed now. But in the 60s and 70s, very clearly that these were good girl role models and these were not. And Cathy is awful. She's rude and she's spoilt and she's brattish and she does what she wants. She just lives hard and dies hard like a boy.
Was part of the appeal that you could live vicariously through her, do you think?
Probably.
And is that what you've done as a novelist ever since?
Yeah, absolutely. People say, are you very adventurous? No. Do I like writing about mountains, horses and big battles? Absolutely. I am a very optimistic and quite sunny person. But I love to have those huge emotions. And reading Wuthering Heights, I absolutely understood that fiction can change everything about who you are while you're reading that book.
Did you love it straight away? Did you get it straight away?
Yes.
It's quite a difficult book. It's a book of two halves in a way, isn't it?
It is. And people who've seen film adaptations often don't realise that it is a very bizarre book. There's actually 3 time zones. There is the framing device, Lockwood, the narrator, the best final paragraph in literature, in my opinion, when he's walking over for the last time and he says, I lingered there under that benign sky, and he's there with finding the 3 graves there. So you've got the framing device, and then you've got the first bit of the story with the Cathy and Heathcliff, and then you have the second bit, Catherine and Edgar and the next generation, their children down, which is 30 years on. So it's a book that's all over the place, and that's another thing that I think I understood, that brilliance is not neat. It's not about being perfect on a tiny scale. And I understood reading Wuthering Heights, and I think I've lived by that ever since, that it's better to really have a go and fail than to do something perfect and tiny. I don't remember consciously thinking, if I ever write a novel, I'm going to be as ambitious as I can be with it. But I think that's where it came from.
And that's about ambition and scale.
And being prepared to fail.
But it's also, when you look at Wuthering Heights, you've already alluded to it, it's not just about Cathy and Heathcliff, it's about the Moors themselves, and the Moors being a character in the book. Your own novels are so rooted in a particular part of France, in particular times in history. Do you think Wuthering Heights helped you? Did it steer you towards that sort of subject matter?
Yes, absolutely, because the lead character in Wuthering Heights is the Moors. When I'm walking in Carcassonne or the Pyrenees or the Fishbourne Marshes, for me the idea that many feet have trodden this way before and many feet will walk this way long after I'm gone, I find really reassuring, that sense of the continuum of human experience. That doesn't make me feel sad that I won't be there to see it. It makes me feel that this is where love lies, this is where truth lies, in the land, and this space that we all walk through, and our time is very short. That's where real history lies.
Your Languedoc series of novels, Labyrinth, Sepulchre and Citadel, which you started in 2005, are set largely around the southern French medieval city of Carcassonne. What was it about that area of France that appealed to you as a novelist?
I had never heard of it at all. My husband, who actually I met at school when we were 15, but then we'd gone our separate ways, and then we met years later on a train, and he'd been living in Paris and had discovered that France was his country, and I didn't go until 1989, and we got off the train because there were no flights then, and walk down through the modern town, the Bastide, which is 14th century. And anyone who goes to France will know the thing that happens out of season in France. At 7:01, everything's deserted. There's nobody about. And you could hear kind of footsteps somewhere elsewhere in the mist, but there was not a soul about. And we walked through and we got to the Pont Vieux, the old bridge which separates the sort of medieval part from the, well, slightly less medieval part. And I stepped up onto the bridge and I looked across and I saw the fortified citadel of Carcassonne, 52 towers and turrets, big spotlights all round, nobody about. And it was a coup de foudre. I just fell in love. And it was straightforward. I just thought, I belong here. That was it. It was utterly visceral moment, exactly the same. Now I'm talking to you, I can see that I felt as a 6-year-old in the theatre and as a 9-year-old in the museum. I'm sitting on the seawall reading Wuthering Heights, that kind of punch to the gut where you think, this is my place. And I didn't intend to write about it, but when you fall in love, you want to learn everything about. So I started to read about the story of the Cathars, a group of heretical Christians who lived and died and were persecuted in that part of France in the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries. And I, little by little, had it's still how it feels after all these years, what I call the whispering in the landscape. And that is where every single one of my novels begins. The idea that there is something whispering, saying, there's a story for you here. So I've never decided to set a story anywhere. I've just been somewhere and then the whispering started, and that's what happened.
In the distance, a white July mist was hovering above the Montagne Noire. The breaking sky on the horizon was slashed through with pink and purple. As she stood looking out over the perfect patchwork of fields of barley, corn and wheat, and the woodlands that stretched further than her eye could see, Alice felt the presence of the past all around her, embracing her. Spirits, friends and ghosts who held out their hands and whispered of their lives and shared their secrets with her.
A lot of writers have said this, that sometimes you have to go away in order to just hear your own writing voice, to not have any of the things that make you around you.
And did you have to write in Carcassonne throughout that whole trilogy of books?
No.
Did you have to embed yourself in the environment?
Yes, I absolutely had to embed myself in the environment, and I am completely embedded in the environment. Every new book I start where it's set, but once I've done a week or two there, it's in me.
And when you're searching for inspiration or doing the research and you're there in the very place where real people, the inspirations for your characters, the people that lived and died in Carcassonne, does it make you feel like you are sharing their world in a way?
Yes, absolutely. And it's about the responsibility. I mean, that sounds a bit highfalutin, but it is what I feel, that if you write fiction inspired by the past, then you owe it to the people of the past to try to get it right. All of my books put women's stories at the heart of them. They are about the unheard and underheard stories of women. And it's also about common sense, because you know what, we were always there too. But history has often been written from a very narrow lens, mostly a white male lens, and mostly it has come out of religious institutions and universities which did not allow women in. So obviously much of women's history has just it's been pretended it wasn't there. And it matters because often what is happening now, prejudice and bigotry that is happening in the present day, is often justified by the fact that it's always been like this. So it matters that we go back to history and get it right. So I could write the story that I wrote, Labyrinth, and in my fiction at the moment, in the City of Tears, which is set in 1572 to 1594 in Paris and Amsterdam, the sort of women I want to write, because those women existed. I think a lot of people can identify with history and can understand history when it's personal. If you are writing a character, as I have been with City of Tears, a woman whose daughter goes missing, do we really think that she felt less than we would? Of course not. Of course she felt the same. If in the middle of this huge historical event, one of my children went missing, and my choice is to leave and never know what happened, or to stay and potentially risk everybody else being killed. So my job as a historical novelist is always to say, put yourself in their shoes. And out of that, comes the story for me. So landscape first, and then the mixture of adventure and mystery and history.
You've got to trust your characters in a way, haven't you?
You've
That
got to
they
trust
will
your
tell
characters.
you their story.
Exactly. It always feels... There's an amazing moment, and if I'm lucky, it's in chapter 1, but it might not be till chapter 5, and I'll have to go back and sort the beginning out, where it feels like that the lead character is standing there, and she will turn around and hold out her hand and say, here we go, and then we're off.
You don't always know who the protagonist is
No.
when you start writing?
No. I know the sort of person they're likely to be.
You're auditioning them, you know.
I'm auditioning them. No, because sometimes, I mean, it was the great writer Annie Proulx once said to me, so Kate, if the characters don't move the plot forward, they die. And I just remember thinking that was a great bit of advice. Because actually, you know, I know that I need this kind of character because somebody has to be there to chaperone a girl, for example, and in that period of time she wouldn't have been allowed to go out on her own. She would have had to have an older woman there. So then I start writing and I think, oh, you're good. And then other times I start writing, I think, you're just not cutting it, I'm afraid. Off you go.
You haven't got one.
You haven't got it. You know, you're off. You're going to be, you know, because there's a high body count in my books, there's, you know, and sometimes I'm really surprised by the way it's turned out, the way it's going.
Given that you'd written 4 novels already before Labyrinth was published in 2005, what did that success, because it was a bestseller, what did that success mean to you? What did it feel like?
Oh, God, it changed nothing, and it changed everything. It changed nothing because I was an overnight success at the age of 45. And it changed everything because I could be a full-time writer. I've been a publisher and I know that so much luck is involved. It's so much being on a fair wind behind you. So I didn't have unrealistic expectations. But it meant, I think, John, I really enjoyed every minute because I just felt incredibly lucky. Then standing in the Tesco's in Bognor and seeing a novel by me at number 1, it's not that everything that's happened since doesn't mean as much, because of course it does. But it wasn't what I'd expected, and it meant that I never had to have a proper job again. And that has also, as it's turned out, been very helpful, because of the responsibilities I now have.
Your next big cultural moment takes us back to the 1991 Booker Prize for Fiction. Not an inspiration as such, more of a provocation.
Provocation.
Possibly.
This is the Booker shortlist as it was announced this afternoon for 1991. The first book is Time's Arrow by Martin Amis. The second book is The Famished Road by Ben Okri. The third book is The Redundancy of Courage by Timothy Moe. The fourth is Such a Long Journey by Rohinton Mystery. The Van is the fifth book by Roddy Doyle. And the last one is Two Lives, Reading Turgenev by William Trevor. All right. Who wants to start? What do you think of it?
Oh, God.
What?
They're all boys.
No, there's no woman.
1 minute.
Yeah.
The 1991 Booker Prize shortlist had no women on it at all. Now, I should say, before you get bombarded with people complaining, a judging panel has the right to decide the books that they think most fulfill the criteria of the prize, and more importantly, make the hair on the back of their neck stand on end. It's not a science. This is just a different group of 5 people will choose a different group of books. It just so happened in this year that there were no women on the list at all. And there were many extraordinary women published within that time period, not least of all Angela Carter, Margaret Atwood, a lot of the very big, brilliant names.
Who were eligible for that year.
Who were eligible for that year. Even that was not the point. The point was nobody noticed. And it was only when the list was put out, people started to say, there are no women on this list. And the judges said quite rightly, well, these were the books that we chose. But a lot of us started to say, can you imagine if they'd put out an all-female list? Everybody would have said it was political. Nobody would have believed that it was done on merit alone. And so there was a lot of talk in the press. It was journalists who started to say it's quite odd that there are no women, given all of these. What do we value in literature, and how do people decide what is worth celebrating and honouring and what not? And so a group of us, men and women, who were in publishing and in, nobody quite owns up to calling this first meeting. We all know where it was, but the person whose flat it was says she didn't call the meeting, she just offered. But about 40 of us found ourselves in a flat in North London in 1992, we just thought, OK, we need to do some research, because this just might be one of those things. This particular judges, this particular year. But when we started to do research, a very clear picture came through, which was this, that although 60% of novels published in the UK were authored by women, and some 75% of novels were bought by women, fewer than 9% of novels ever shortlisted for any major literary prize were by women. So in other words, it wasn't about women's access to market, but it was about the valuing of writing. And this kind of dishonesty that there is such a thing as a neutral voice. And what that actually meant is literature with a capital L was actually a male voice. And that books by women were often seen as peripheral to the real literature. And when books had done well in the Booker, particularly authored by women, not all of them, but quite a few of them had male protagonists. And so we decided the best thing to do, because we thought it mattered, because a lot of people buy on prize shortlists, was to launch, in a positive and optimistic sense, a prize to honour and celebrate writing by women.
It took you 5 years to set the prize up, in fact, didn't it?
It did, but that was the money, not the research. You
needed a sponsor.
We needed a sponsor, and my breakthrough, I suppose, was good old Radio 4, coming on Woman's Hour to talk about why we wanted to launch a prize, and an elderly lady hearing the interview and getting in touch and saying, I have had a great deal of pleasure all of my life from reading. And she said, I've been listening to you this morning, and I would like to give something back, and I will endow the prize in perpetuity. And at first I thought it was my sister, I said, is that you? And they said, no. We had this conversation. And then another older woman, the sculptress, as she always called herself, and I respect how she wanted to call herself, Grizzle Niven, who was an enormously important part of the Slade art scene in the 20s, actually David Niven's sister, extraordinary woman. And she then said, I will give you a small cast that you can recast every year of one of my big sculptures to give each year's winner. So suddenly I had these two beautiful things from two women in their 80s. Actually what gave me something to bargain with, because I then could go to, and there were lots of us doing it. It wasn't just me, it was just that I was the one doing the talking.
You were the driving force, really, weren't you?
Well, I was the one doing the talking. There were lots of people doing lots of stuff, but I was doing the chat. So could then go to sponsors and say, look, you've already got the equivalent of a £30,000 a year purse, a work of art that can be recast every year.
That was your Bessie, as it became known.
Bessie, as it's known. So all you need to do is give me the money to run it. And you can name it. The anonymous donor wants to be anonymous. Nobody else wants any limelight for this. And that was that. And it's 27 years now, and it has fulfilled everything that we wanted, which is to put exceptional writing by women in the hands of men and women who would love it.
There was resistance at the time, wasn't there? As soon as you set up A.S. Byatt, who I think had won the Booker Prize the previous year to the all-male shortlist in 1990, she had won. She's reported to have refused to allow her publishers to enter her book for the prize.
Absolutely. And that is absolutely fine, because we don't all have to agree. People don't think men will agree with each other just because they're men, but there is often a pressure on women that all women must think exactly the same. But actually, it's completely okay for people to not think it's a good idea. You always should respect the author's wishes. But there was a range of women who did not think it was a good idea, and I utterly respect that. They felt that they had been battling to be allowed into equal shared spaces, and that this was a backward step. And I respect that. I don't respect people moaning. There was a lot of very silly stuff, which just didn't really engage with it, which was like, if women were any good, they'd win the real prizes, without any ability to think of what we were trying to do about how literature is valued and why people often reflect their own image back at them and what they've read back at them.
Jane Austen did well enough in a man's world, and with the present enthusiasm for her works, you might wonder why her present-day sisters need extra help.
I suppose prizes were always welcome, but I'm not absolutely sure that we need one for women. The reason for that the prize started, I gather, was that a novel by Angela Carter, Wise Children, didn't make it to the Booker shortlist, but a lot of books don't make it to the Booker shortlist, including most of the novels of Martin Amis, and we don't have a prize for 40-year-old lads.
Obscene, brutal, boring and dreary drivel was the way the Daily Telegraph greeted the shortlist this morning.
I naively thought we were launching a literature prize where we'd be celebrating women's achievements. You would think that I had put up a banner outside my house saying, kill men.
That kickback must have been quite difficult. I mean, Salman Rushdie, another former Booker Prize winner, he was very critical as well. Did it feel like a struggle at the time?
I'll tell you what, I don't know how I would have coped these days. The thing was, we thought it was the right thing. And I did ring up the anonymous donor. It was the only time I spoke to her directly, because it was really horrible.
Is she still anonymous?
No, she is still anonymous, but she's not alive anymore. She's remained anonymous. Nobody, even in the Women's Prize structure, knows, just me.
Still to this day?
Yeah. Because that was the deal, and I have respected that, obviously. There was some quite funny journalism when the Bessie was announced that it was the Queen. It wasn't the Queen. So when we were doing all of this kind of stuff, I rang her up because it was very bloody and very horrible, and I don't know how I would have coped with social media because it was endless. Getting letters, your husband must be ashamed of you, really nasty stuff. The very first question I was ever asked when I announced the prize at the ICA. I did a very passionate, enthusiastic speech. Didn't know any journalists. I didn't know who they were. I said, anybody got any questions? And a tweedy arm went up at the back of the hall from a man. I later learnt was from the Daily Express. And the very first question on record that was asked of the Women's Prize was to me, are you a lesbian?
No.
That was the very first question. And to which the answer was, no, are you? And that was the end of that. But it was very horrible. And people got my home number and would ring up. And, I can remember very clearly ringing up when I was making the children's tea and saying, I can't talk, but I'll talk later. And then it appearing in the paper, Moss refuses to answer. It was horrible. But it was fine because we all believed in it, because there was an issue. So let's see if we can sort it out. Not all, but almost all of the women who were not in favour subsequently changed their minds because they could see what we were doing. And what was so interesting was that every time I went to do an interview, it started with somebody saying, so you're really angry? And I would say, do I look angry? This is about celebrating amazing writing by women. It's not about attacking men. It was like we were stuck in a loop of the 1970s. Journalists, for the most part, were having a different argument from the one that we were trying to have, which is we set up a prize to celebrate amazing fiction by women for men and women who love reading. We're not trying to shut the other prize down or change it. This is what we're doing.
And looking back, the roll call of winners and nominees, I mean, it's like a who's who of contemporary fiction, isn't it? Ali Smith or Chimamanda Adichie or Marilyn Robinson, all of these people who have won over the years. What effect has the prize had, do you think, on the literary landscape and readers?
Well, in a way, I should ask that question back to you, because of your huge experience of interviewing and doing all of these things, you see all of it. And I'm always very careful to not make claims for the prize that we couldn't substantiate. However, we set it up because 9% of novels that ever were shortlisted for literary prizes were by women, and now it's about 45%. Now, that's not only the Women's Prize, but what the Women's Prize has done has certainly been a magnet for these conversations. It's enabled a dialogue about these things. Because people ask me every year, it's so successful, the prize, but every year people say, why do we need the Women's Prize? And of course, the thing is, we don't need any prize. But do we need, particularly in these rather ugly times, to celebrate the best and beautiful writing? We do. And do we also need to have a narrative of women's voices that is positive? We do. And we've all seen in the last few years how easily things go backwards as well as forwards. It's back to the historical fiction that I write. One of the reasons I think I am an optimistic person by nature is that history is a pendulum. It goes backwards and forwards. Things don't just get better and stay there. We're seeing this all over the world. And that sense of women's voices being heard and protecting that, it still matters. But for me, it's a great joy. I love being a writer. I love readers, and I do feel that the Women's Prize will go on and it will continue to put extraordinary voices in front of people who otherwise would not have heard of them. It's just about standing shoulder to shoulder in the end.
Kate Moss, thank you so much indeed.
Thank you, John.
And if you enjoyed that conversation with Kate Moss, in which she revealed her love of ancient Egypt, let me recommend a previous episode featuring another novelist, Booker Prize winner Penelope Lively, who actually spent her childhood in wartime Cairo.
Here was I, English, but surrounded by all the the signals of other cultures. I mean, an Islamic country, but in which there was a great tradition of the French, Lebanese, Greek, and so forth. So there were all sorts of identities all around. And I was very confused about this business of being English, because it was very much drummed into you that this was good. And if you looked at the map, there was brave little England up at the top, pink, and lots of pink around the rest of the world, and pink was good. I've had a lot of unlearning to do, a great deal.
Penelope Lively, one of our many guests on This Cultural Life, from Paul McCartney and Tracy Emin to, more recently, Armando Iannucci and Eileen Atkins. The whole back catalogue is available on BBC Sounds.
This Cultural Life is produced by Edwina Pittman.
Mark 60 years of Jamaica's independence with BBC Sounds. Delve into the life of a reggae pioneer with Knowing Bob Marley.
He felt that his job was to bring people together through music.
Hear his songs like never before with Exodus, Bob Marley reimagined. And immerse yourself in the island's vibration with the Jamaica 60 soundscape.
Now in comes the musical thing.
Celebrating 6 decades of Jamaica's independence. Listen on BBC Sounds.
BBC News at 8 o'clock. The Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng has promised that more support is coming to help with the cost of living. Mr Kwarteng, who's a key ally of the Conservative leadership frontrunner Liz Truss, has made the comments in tomorrow's Mail on Sunday. The latest forecast suggests average household gas and electricity bills could hit more than £6,000 next April. Our business correspondent Mark Ashdown says this new estimate should be treated with some caution.
This is all pretty speculative. It's based on the wholesale gas price. That changes daily. It's volatile, fluctuates. Auxilium themselves say they don't want to scaremonger. They admit the price could change. Ofgem told me they never speculate on the longer-term forecast. Their focus is on the current energy price cap. The latest change to that is due to be published on Friday. It'll kick in October. They're expecting it to be about £3,500 a year. Already a big rise for average households. Then this, though, I think will increase worry.
The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps has urged the head of the RMT union to put a pay offer from Network Rail to workers after another day of strike action. More than 45,000 railway staff from the RMT, the TSSA and the Unite unions walked out over pay, jobs and conditions. Russian officials say a Ukrainian drone has been shot down above the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. It's the second assault of its kind against the base in less than a month. The exam board Pearson has apologised after some BTEC students didn't receive their results as expected last Thursday when A-level grades were released. Pearson said a very small percentage of students in England and Wales had been affected. A man's appeared in court after being charged with the abduction and sexual assault of a 6-year-old girl. She was taken in Droylsden in Greater Manchester on Wednesday afternoon. Police say she was reunited with her family a short time later. In football, Arsenal have gone top of the Premier League following a 3-0 win over Bournemouth. It's the first time Arsenal have won their opening 3 matches since 2004. BBC News.
A little later this evening, Russell Davis asked the questions in the classic general knowledge quiz. Brain of Britain is at 11 o'clock. But now on Radio 4, a double first for Archive on 4 as Alex Krotowski celebrates 10 years of The Digital Human live from the Edinburgh Festival.
This is The Digital Human. I'm Alex Krotowski, and for the last 10 years on Radio 4, I have been your hitchhiker's guide to the internet, from its bright sparks to its dark passages. Along with a team of devoted producers and researchers, we have spent 158 episodes cataloging our co-evolution with the digital world. And tonight, it is my pleasure to interpret what we have learned across a decade that has been so shaped by technology that we don't even get excited anymore about having a piece of glass in our pockets that connects us to everything and everyone in the world. But what has it done to us? How has it changed who we think we are, who we want to be with, and the balance of power in politics, in the workplace, and on the streets? What you're going to hear tonight will be voices and stories from past programs, and we will also be joined by some special guests. And all of this is accompanied by music composed and performed for the occasion by Andrew Vasilik and the amazing band. So, let us begin with one of our absolute favorite episodes. Can you believe that as recently as 10 years ago, we still couldn't quite get it into our heads that it's possible to make actual meaningful connections with people that we only know online?
My name is Jack. I'm from Boston. Redditor user Chewy01234. I got my kidney transplant in the fall of 2001. I was visiting my mom back in New York, and I had forgot my pill bottles. This particular medicine Prograf is very time sensitive, and the longer you're off the medicine, the greater the risk of acute rejection. And I was looking at not having my pills for 2 days straight.
Hi there, we've got some severe weather heading into the northeast of the United States. A huge snowstorm is going to develop here as we go through the next 24 to 48 hours.
I've never really seen snow in a city that bad before. All the roads are shut down. It was illegal to drive on the roads, basically. So I started calling pharmacies. Nobody was open. Nobody was even answering the phones. So I figured, okay, I got to get to the hospital now. And the only way I could get to the hospital at that point, I realized, is with an ambulance. And I would have to pay for the ambulance ride there and back for just one dose of medicine. And single ambulance ride is at least $800, $1,000 they could charge you. Is not something I could have afforded, definitely not. Earlier on in the day, I had the idea to ask on Reddit, "Our Boston, can you help out a guy with a kidney transplant in a snowstorm?" The first few responses really actually are the ones that touched my heart. Somebody was like, "I have the medicine, but I don't have a car." And somebody was like, "I have a car, but I want to get you that medicine." It was almost like I was doing them a favor, giving them this chance to help out another human being.
I was looking at Reddit trying to find photos that people had posted of the snowstorm, and I saw Jack's request for medications. My name is Amy Holdorf. My username is Rockstar Ames. At the time, I was being weaned off of that medication, so I had many pills to spare. Also, my car was parked in a garage, so I did not have to dig out my car. And finally, I grew up in the northern United States, so I've been driving in the snow all of my life.
Amy, on the other side of the city, began to compose a message.
Rockstar Ames. I just sent you a message. I have Prograf to spare and a car that doesn't need digging out. I live in Brookline and can probably get it to you.
I just couldn't believe it. I was in my computer chair and I rolled back and threw my hands in the air and I just had this I'm getting my medicine.
Boston was covered deep in something like 22 to 30 inches of snow in parts. It was very beautiful. I arrived at his apartment building and I climbed over a snowdrift. He came down with his girlfriend and we just said, "Hi, thanks," and gave me a big hug. And
I just remember, I don't know, it sounds kind of cheesy, but I remember when she got out of the car, I was like, this is what an angel looks like.
He gave me a little pack of goodies in a little bag, some beer and some muffins, and we talked for a few minutes, and then I went home.
I felt awkward, and I wish I could have actually expressed more gratitude to her at the time, but I felt so, I don't know, I felt so vulnerable that it was hard to talk to her. I didn't even invite her in, actually. I just remember feeling so, what could I say to her now that she saved my life? I don't know. I can definitely understand why Amy thinks it wasn't a big deal. I feel like that there's a lot to say in just actually helping somebody.
taken us a long time for us to really believe that when you virtually reach out and touch someone, it can feel just like offline, that you share a little piece of yourself with that other person. And over time, and with repeated attention, that touch could change everything. But we also know that this has limits. The pandemic taught us that there are boundaries for how much we can actually connect online. But for people who live in a world of boundaries, the digital world can be a place of freedom, where connection is limitless. And in our next story, one father discovers just how meaningful that can be.
It must have been around age 3 when we started to observe that he was using, we called it different strategies for climbing ladders, for not running around with the other children. And then at the age of 4, they had this diagnosis. They said that he had Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And Mats was in the need of a wheelchair as from when he was 8 to 9 years old. The prognosis when we got this diagnosis was that very few of these boys get to become 20 years old. Then a little bit later, let's say when he was around 10, 11, we introduced computers to him. But maybe Mats was given a little bit more time to play all these games than what his comrades were given.
Matt's interests expanded exponentially. Words on a screen turned into avatars, separated by physical distance but intimate in mind space. One of his soulmates became young mum Exina.
Pretty much each night when my kids had gone to bed, then we were role-playing, and I would say about 5 or 6 years we spoke every night, pretty much.